After 8 long months and an update to his profile picture, Pixel Captain has finally released the finale of The Masked Devotion, capping his magnum opus off with a very dark but satisfying conclusion. However, just like with The Masked Resurgence, this series can be very confusing to the casual viewer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you haven't watched this video's predecessor, then you're probably confused about what I'm even talking about, so let me fill you in on what you missed. Pixel Captain is an animator who has been developing a multi-series alternate universe set in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's. In my previous video, I discussed how, since each episode in Pixel Captain series is a music video, the overarching storyline can be a little bit hard to decipher at times. This, paired with the fact that song lyrics won't always convey what's going on in the video at the moment, create a wonderful opportunity for avid lore enthusiasts such as I to come in and explain to all who may be confused. Now, to avoid any more confusion, let me catch you up on all the events of the last video. Got that? Good. As promised in that video, I do another analysis of Pixel's series when The Masked Devotion finish, and guess what just so happened to occur this Halloween night. Now, the big difference between The Masked Resurgence and The Masked Devotion is the simple matter of its characters. Unlike the original 4-part series, which primarily focused on Springtrap, Nightmare, and Scrap Baby, The Masked Devotion is almost entirely composed of OCs. This means that we have no predetermined lore to go off of, as these characters have no storyline outside of what is shown in The Masked Devotion. Well, everyone except Michael, but the series is so devoid of actual FNAF lore at this point that Michael's basically a completely different character. But enough of this intro. Let's dive into the meat and bones of this video. It's time to discuss the lore of The Masked Devotion. The story opens mere hours after the capture of Afton's corpse from our little horror story. The police are bringing the empty shell of Springtrap to the middle of a cornfield, planting him on a stake and igniting it. As we watch the flames begin to engulf Springtrap's body, Michael steps out from behind the cop car, carefully watching the corpse burn. However, to his side, something moves within the corn stalks. The camera pans for us to get a better look, but the figure darts out of the way. Michael begins to leave the scene as he too notices these figures before we are given a montage of Springtrap's decay. He slowly crumbles to the ground, rotting once again. But that wouldn't be a very satisfying conclusion, now would it? The previous animation was a mere prologue short by Pixel. Now it's time for the real first episode. Fading in from darkness, we begin the episode by seeing Michael hunched over and watching one of the unnamed figures from the prologue as they dig up the body of Springtrap. Around them stand more of these figures, each one wearing a concealing mask, like a cult. Kneeling down and protruding a human heart, the cult leader plants the organ within Springtrap's suit, before revealing a small red vial. And just like that, William's story came to an end, and the Reaper's story began. The red liquid morphing and corrupting his body, the newly born Reaper begins to chase down Michael. Despite taking multiple gunshots, it just keeps coming, almost unrecognizable from its old persona, his heart glowing within the dark field. Michael, however, manages to escape, bursting from the field out toward his car. In close pursuit, the Reaper unfurls a pair of long, fleshy arms from its back, similar to the wings Springtrap was given by Nightmare. As Michael narrowly avoids each attack from the Reaper, his car is inevitably hit, and Michael is sent careening off the road, slamming into the shaft of a power line. When Michael comes to, the Reaper begins to slowly approach the flaming vehicle. Upon desperately trying to dial for the police, the Reaper's arms start slowly carving into the car, as the man himself walks ever so closer, seemingly not noticing Michael. As soon as he is spotted, however, Michael's ripped out of his car through the ceiling as one of the Reaper's arms grabs him by the throat and begins to lift him above the ground. Letting out a triumphant roar, the Reaper stands in front of the wreckage, choking Michael above his gaping maw. However, as the episode concludes with a long shot of Michael's discarded phone, we can faintly see police sirens blaring their red and blue lights reflected off the dashboard. But police couldn't arrive that fast, or at least not from a spontaneous call like this. Or at least from a call they didn't expect. The second episode begins with us in the perspective of a police officer driving down the road with a team of SWAT operatives tracking Michael's call. For a brief moment, we can see a can of gasoline hidden in the back of the police cruiser before the car speeds off and we're given a title sequence. We then cut to earlier in the day, where the officer met Michael. Michael then started laying out all the evidence that connected to the mysterious Springtrap cult, with markings on his map detailing the location of the cult's meeting spot as well as a nearby cliff. After a quick discussion, the officer agrees to Michael's plan before we transition back to the present. The Reaper still has a hold of Michael, but his attention is shaken when the cops arrive. As the SWAT members mobilize and the song begins to crescendo, the Reaper reluctantly drops Michael to the ground, begins to float, and the officer gives the order to fire. When we finally return from the fight scene, we begin to follow the view of the cult leader. While the cops and Michael were busy fighting the Reaper, he had made his way back to the abandoned and burned Fredbear's family diner, approaching the decayed body of Scrap Baby. From her wrists, a black substance leaked outwards as the cult leader took out another vial and extracted it. Slitting his own palm and drizzling some of his blood into the mixture, the cult leader then pulls out another heart, planting the needle into it the same way he did the Springtrap. Shifting back to the main attraction, upon noticing Michael trying to escape, the Reaper drops from midair and begins attacking again, tearing off the car door as Michael drives away with the SWAT team. As they seemingly escape, the Reaper learns to teleport and destroys a different cruiser. Extending his arms to a disturbing length, the Reaper leaped onto the back of Michael's cruiser before this SWAT agent became the main protagonist and shot him point blank, sending the Reaper flying. Although the damage is minimal, the time it buys Michael and company is critical for their plan. After a quick transition, we see the Reaper walking down the same road we saw Michael take, eventually reaching a cliffside as we see a quick shot of Michael gearing up in a fire proximity suit. The Reaper is then ambushed from behind, faced with the entire police force with guns trained on him. However, when he spots Michael, he begins to panic as Michael lights and drops a match to the ground, igniting a trail of gasoline and combusting the Reaper. The SWAT team begins to open fire as this happens, with the Reaper weakened by the fire, as Michael draws a shock baton and begins to approach the damaged monster. Stabbing him in his false heart, Michael takes a hit from the Reaper, but continues to push, eventually popping the organ. With his power source destroyed, the Reaper's eyes are consumed by a flash of light as he falls to his death. The screen fades from black to the lifeless body of the Reaper, the police officer from earlier standing over him. Putting a point-blank shotgun blast into his head, the camera pans over to Michael, who is nursing the injury he got from the Reaper. However, soon after, his eyes go red. Episode 3 begins directly after The Devil Inside, with Michael still being actively possessed by the cult leader. Even as he drives home, visions of the cultists continue to appear, surrounding him. This comes to a climax when Michael arrives back at his house, and the possession begins fighting for control of his body. We see brief flashes of the cult leader as he battles for Michael's mind, even including small flashes of the Reaper's silhouette as Michael looks up his staircase. However, Michael can't resist forever, and soon enough, he's overtaken by the possession. The newly possessed Michael then begins making his way down the street, looking for something. Approaching a discarded mirror by the garbage, Michael gets a brief moment of freedom as he peers into his reflection, only to see the cult leader staring back at him. But in an instant, the possession comes back, causing Michael to shatter the mirror and use a shard of glass to slice himself open. From within him, ropes of metal begin to jut out, enveloping his body in steel, and forcing the wound open further. Turning his head, Michael has almost been completely overtaken by the demon inside him. Deciding to experiment with his new puppet, the cult leader uses Michael to cause a bit of mindless destruction, destroying lampposts and tossing cars around. However, this does attract the police, and upon noticing the red and blue lights, the cult leader retreated, allowing Michael to flee the scene. As the police come closer and closer to finding Michael's hiding spot, his mind gives into the possession one more time, causing Michael to appear in an all too familiar red plane. Before him is the broken head of Scrap Baby, and to his right, his latest demon.
Take me
Your job is complete. At first, I just wanted your father, but now you show me something far greater. Thank you for giving me full control, Michael.
After slaughtering the cops, the Entanglement begins its trek towards some unseen location, as we're given visions of Michael still trapped within his own mind. The Entanglement eventually reaches this location, being the old Fredbear's family diner, as it enters through the crumbling architecture. Upon entry, we see that the entire establishment had been converted into the base of operations for the ever-present cult, as they worship and tend to old relics from the mass resurgence, as the Entanglement marches through the establishment. Past the body of Scrap Baby sat the cult leader, who thrashed in unison with the Entanglement's movements, and whose eyes were a bright red. The Entanglement kneeled and was crowned by a different cultist, marking it as the leader's new body, as its eyes brightened to the same shade of red. Leaving the perspective of the Entanglement, we return to the officer from the devil inside. Throughout the last episode, he'd been returning to his station with the body of the Reaper in the back of his car, but he was unfortunate enough to encounter the gruesome sight of the Entanglement's rampage. However, he's being tracked by the cult in the background. On top of this, as the officer leaves his car to inspect the scene, one of the cultists sneaks behind his cruiser, vial in hand, and injects it into the dead Reaper. As the officer turns around to face the cultist, the Entanglement makes its appearance. Easily tearing off both arms of the police officer with a single move, the Entanglement taunts the poor policeman before putting him to rest. Returning to Michael, he begins to see visions of his family in front of him. Evan begins to speak to him, and Michael begins to weep for his forgiveness, but immediately after, Evan transforms into his Fredbear form. To Michael's horror, his sister Elizabeth follows suit, transforming into Scrap Baby. Through his misery, Michael finds the strength to begin freeing himself from the Entanglement's control, as William finally assumes his Reaper form. As William speaks to Michael, father to son, the spirits of the absent family infuse Michael one last time. His eyes going bright white, the Entanglement begins to claw at itself, tearing off its own jaw and beginning to split itself in half as parts of its body continue to fight against Michael. Triumphantly, Michael rips the torso of the Entanglement off of himself, revealing his broken body. At the same time, the Reaper begins to animate as Michael's eyes go red once again. The pair fight one final time, but Michael still manages to overpower the Reaper, crushing him into oblivion. In a final act of desperation, Michael tears the ceiling of a nearby house down onto the cultists, killing the lot of them, before succumbing to his injuries and collapsing to the ground. In the final shot of the entire series, we see the nameless cult leader standing over Michael's corpse, with another red vial lying in the foreground, before we receive a quote that, at least to me, alters our entire perception of Pixel Captain's universe. The greatest trick the devil pulled was convincing the world that there was only one of him. Alright, with the storyline out of the way, time for what you really came here for. Similar to the last video, I'm not presenting any of these takes or opinions as facts, because the series is really vague most of the time and it isn't clear about most of its major plot points. Not that that's a bad thing, but it just means that what I'm about to tell you veers more into opinion territory rather than fact. To start, we look at a description of each individual video in the Masked Devotion and its playlist. Unfortunately, unlike the Masked Resurgence, there is no lore hints here, only ominous quotes or phrases about each episode. Moving on to the next source, which are behind the scenes videos, we're also starved for a storyline there, as Pixel hasn't posted any of those videos on the Masked Devotion yet. Unfortunately, these are the only sources of lore I could find besides the videos themselves, as Pixel still hasn't received enough attention for my fellow theorists to help decipher it. Although the commenters on the episodes have been very helpful in pointing out specific details I missed on my multiple watch-throughs. So without further ado, let's start with the prologue. The prologue is short, but it lays out the groundwork for the series. It takes place immediately after Our Little Horror Story, so recently that Springtrap hasn't even taken off his cloak, and he's instantly staked into the ground and lit ablaze. This is actually the first appearance of the police officer that keeps appearing throughout the series, but besides that, the only real lore tidbit until Michael joins the scene is the inclusion of the news report we saw in Left Behind, further cementing how recent this event was. However, as Michael appears, we begin to see our first glances at the reoccurring cult that appears throughout the series. They begin to appear in the background before we are given a time lapse and we are shown a montage of scenes from Drunken Whaler. Moving on to which, Drunken Whaler begins in the same location as the prologue, where we see the Nightmare cult's leader shoveling up Springtrap's corpse, while Michael gathers evidence on the scene. The cult leader then pulls out a human heart, planting it into the wound where Springtrap ripped his own heart out in Our Little Horror Story. He then proceeds to protrude a small red syringe and inject its contents into the newly installed organ, causing Springtrap to rise out of the ground, enveloped by a red mist and by the rest of the cult. One extremely subtle detail in this scene is that the cult leader actually recoils when Springtrap awakens, similar to how he does when we see him in You Are My Sunshine. I'll explain that in a moment, but right now, the newly created Reaper begins hunting Michael down. We then get this long running sequence where Michael discovers that the Reaper is basically immune to bullets and then gets in his car and attempts to drive away. Michael fails to escape, crashes, and manages to dial 911. Probably an animation choice, but the minor fact that he already had 911 queued up on his phone further supports the idea that this was planned by Michael and the cops, which we're about to explore. Once the Reaper has a hold of Michael, we then get the long shot of Michael's phone, and we see the police start to arrive thanks to their blaring red and blue lights. If the prologue laid out the foundation of the series, then Drunken Whaler is an extension of the prologue. It introduces the Nightmare cult, the Reaper, and the mysterious red liquid that keeps appearing throughout the series, and a couple of subtle details that might lead to future connections down the road, such as the leader recoiling. When the cult leader summons the Reaper, he recoils and starts to twitch, and this directly correlates to how the cult leader is seen moving in You Are My Sunshine, in which he controls the entanglement like a puppet. This means that, from here on out, it's a safe bet to assume that the Reaper is being remotely controlled by the cult leader, rather than by William Afton. This is an important detail because it means that William's spirit has officially died within the Masked Devotion timeline, which comes into play later. Until then, it's time for the devil inside. As the episode opens, we see the cop and a SWAT agent track Michael's call to the aptly named Reaper's Wharf cornfield. We then get a quick view of the gasoline can used to ignite the Reaper later in the episode, before they speed off and we're given a flashback to before Drunken Whaler. Here, we can see that Michael has planned this operation out with the cops, as he planned to be seen. We can see blurry text on his map that reads, when paused, "Got them to hear if given signal, i.e. all call." Below that, we can see another blurry message that gets cut off by Michael's hand, but from what we can see, it reads, "My dad is long gone." These messages further support the idea that both Michael planned the events of Drunken Whaler, as well as the fact that William is dead. When we return to the main timeline, there isn't anything lore related until this moment after the first fight scene. In this moment, we see the cult leader approach the dead body of Springtrap and extract a sample of her blood. He then mixes it with his own blood before approaching a corpse in the background and planting a vial into their heart. This scene actually has a ton of storytelling in it, and to start we establish the fact that this is a flashback. Two things support this. One, Fredbear's family Yiner is desolate in this scene, unlike when we see it in You Are My Sunshine. Since everything in this series takes place over a single day, they wouldn't have been able to renovate everything that fast. The second reason is that we know the cult leader is manually controlling the Reaper, so he couldn't be doing anything else at the moment. The other bit of lore in this scene, and the much more obvious one, is the appearance of the mysterious red liquid, which has been confirmed to be Baby's blood. However, thanks to her deal with Nightmare, it's safe to assume the cult leader is actually collecting Nightmare's essence from this scene, which neatly ties back to the Jason Pargin quote from the end of the series and explains why it's so significant to the cult. When the cultist mixes his own blood with Nightmare's, it probably establishes a link between the cult leader and the host of the possessed heart, which is how he's able to control them. But that's all the lore from the flashback, so we return to the battle against the Reaper. Michael drives off and the Reaper follows him. The cops ambush the Reaper, and then we get this scene where the Reaper has been ignited. A few significant things happen in this scene, starting with this moment, where the Reaper actually starts taking gunfire after it's been lit on fire. You can see that for a very brief moment, the Reaper actually begins to sing along to the song. At no point in the Masked Devotion has the Reaper acknowledged the music playing in the background, while in the Masked Resurgence, William mouthed the words to every episode. Along with this, after Michael pops Reaper's heart and gets slashed, as the Reaper falls off the cliff, you can see his eyes go from red to white for just a second. In the Masked Resurgence, a change in eye color represented if William was possessed or not, with red eyes meaning he was under Baby's control, and white eyes meaning he was free. Since the Reaper's eyes went white in this scene, it's safe to assume that, while we've been led to believe that William is dead, the possession of his body actually revived his spirit, but he obviously wasn't able to do anything while the cult leader was in control. That doesn't mean anything now, but it will be significant towards the very end of our analysis. From there, bits of Nightmare's blood enters Mike's system through this open wound, and the cult leader decides to use this opportunity to begin appearing before Michael as well, and then the episode ends. The Devil Inside is comparable to the series finale with how many small details and storyline hints it has. One thing that this series really liked to play around with is perception, specifically toying with our question of who is who. For example, it took me a long time to decipher who was controlling the Reaper throughout these two episodes. I bounced between Nightmare himself, the cult leader, and William for a while, until I discovered this little eye color thing thanks to a commenter on the video itself. That made me think it was William the whole time, but that doesn't work with other details, so I had to move those around. Then I found the cultist movements, and then I had to move more stuff. Anyway, the biggest contribution of this episode was that Nightmare is still in play. His blood is the reason that the Reaper exists, and is soon to be the reason why the Entanglement is created. My Demons follows Michael immediately after he was nursing his wounds, and sadly nothing of any major story significance happens until Michael begins getting attacked by the cult leader remotely, as we can see multiple silhouettes behind him that foreshadow future events. First, we can see a quick flash of the Entanglement, followed by the cult leader, then the cult leader again, then this guy, who I'm pretty sure is the Entanglement, but it's too blurry to tell, then the cult leader again, and then ending the sequence with a very obvious silhouette of the Reaper on his staircase, in the same spot that William stood in our little horror story. Michael then succumbs to his possession. The occultist walks him outside towards a discarded mirror, to where he sees the cult leader in his own reflection and shatters it, using a piece of glass to cut himself open. From the wound, fire out multiple steel tentacles, which I assume are manifestations of Nightmare's powers, because if that just confirmed the existence of Sister Location in the Pixel Captain timeline, I'm about to be very confused. Anyway, the tentacles overtake Michael, he starts destroying stuff, the police begin to arrive, and right here, we can notice these dark cracks in Michael's head. These foreshadow the damage done to his body by the Entanglement that we see in You Are My Sunshine, as he takes on his actual post-Ennard look in that episode. Regardless of that, Michael then does something very interesting. He somehow visits William's personal hell. This scene implies a lot, but the biggest thing is that this red plane is no longer exclusive to William. It's exclusive to Nightmare. This actually isn't a massive logical leap, as Scrap Baby's head is proudly on display in both occasions where characters visit this area, and we know that Scrap Baby made a deal with Nightmare. This is further supported when the cult leader appears before Michael. He gives a little monologue that I'll come back to, but for now, Michael is overrun by the metal wires and loses all control, creating the entanglement. As the entanglement fends off the cops, we can see brief moments of the cult leader overtaking his body. After flattening half the police force, the entanglement turns to the camera menacingly, and suddenly, we only have one episode left. I went over most of the real story bits in the summary, but I'd like to come back to this scene. Right here, the cultist says, "At first, I just wanted your father." And to me, this has two meanings. The first one's obvious, the cult leader wanted to revive Springtrap and create the Reaper. However, there is another way to perceive this quote, and while it's a little bit far off, it's worth a thought or two. I believe that, in this scene, Nightmare is speaking through the cult leader. Since Nightmare is dead, he died alongside Baby at the end of the mass resurgence, it's safe to assume that a part of him survived through her. And since the cult leader has been mixing his own blood with Baby's, who had allowed Nightmare to flow through her, my interpretation of this scene is that Nightmare appeared before Michael, using the cult leader as a host. Now, I'm unsure if this means that Nightmare has always been possessing the cult leader, but there is evidence to support that idea. Specifically, this quote shown at the very end of the series. In the background, we can see the faint outlines of Nightmare and the Reaper, but we know that the Reaper has been manually puppeted by the cult leader. Therefore, this quote could be referring to Nightmare and the cult leader, but then again, I'm not sure. I do feel like Nightmare is somehow still present in this series in a way besides his blood, as it feels very unlikely to me that a random cultist somehow tracked down Scrap Baby, extracted Nightmare's blood, knew to inject it into a heart, and then just happened to stumble across Springtrap and knew exactly how to revive him. Regardless, this is all speculation, and Pixel said that he'd give some more lore hints within a few weeks, so we'll see about my theories then. Until that day comes, however, it's time to finish off the series. You Are My Sunshine opens up with us watching the entanglement march towards an unseen location. Meanwhile, Michael is still trapped within the entanglement, being forced forward like a puppet. Eventually, we see where the entanglement had been heading, Fredbear's family diner, or what's left of it. However, when we see inside the wrecked establishment, we find out that this is the cult's current base of operations, and it is packed with mementos from Pixel's AU, such as Fredbear with the body of Evan Afton still inside it, Scrap Baby being harvested for more Nightmare energy, and in the far back of the building, the cult leader, writhing in tandem with the entanglement's movements. The entanglement is crowned as the leader's new body before his eyes go bright red. Now, I'm unsure what this new eye color means, but I assume it's just a visual representation of the cult leader taking full control after the entanglement had been crowned. Fading from that scene, we return to the perspective of the cop we saw in The Devil Inside, as he drives home with the body of the Reaper in his backseat. He then encounters the scene of the entanglement's rampage, and upon getting out of his car, a cult member sneaks up behind him carrying a vial of Nightmare's blood, before reaching into his car and injecting the body of the Reaper once again. The entanglement then appears, attacking the cop and tearing his arms. Wait, did his arms just get ripped off because of his grip on the shotgun? This guy must have the strongest grip on the planet if his arms detach before his hands fail. Anyway, the entanglement then impales the cop, and the video focuses on Michael again, who is visited by his family's spirits. Evan appears first, and Michael can be silently saying, "I'm sorry," before his brother violently changes forms and reappears as Fredbear. Elizabeth followed suit, becoming Scrap Baby, and William changes as well, becoming the Reaper. Just like he did in The Devil Inside, William sings along to the song before all three spirits collapse and imbue Michael with the power to escape. The entanglement then tears itself apart as the cult leader begins fighting for control of the monster, as represented by these conflicting wires, but Michael eventually frees himself, now in his post-Ennard form from the games. Meanwhile, the Reaper awakens from within the cruiser, and the two begin to fight. But the battle's over quickly, with Michael easily overpowering his dad and crushing him. I don't know where his body went. But as his spirits begin to fade, Michael kills the remaining cultists before collapsing to the ground. As the camera fades away, we see the cult leader stand before his two creations, as the vial of Nightmare's blood is seen in the foreground. And just like that, it's over. There are two main scenes in this video to decipher, the first of which being the reunion of Michael and his family. First of all, the spirits here seem to be taking on their latest appearances before death, as we can see that Evan still appears possessed, and William becomes the Reaper rather than Springtrap. Now the reason as to why the spirits are here is interesting. For Evan and William it makes sense, as Evan seemingly forgave Michael for his death, and William never wanted him to die in the first place. But Elizabeth is the variable here. Throughout the masked resurgence, Baby's only goal was to torture William, and she planned to do that by having him kill Michael. My only idea as to why she might be willing to help him escape the Cult Leader's control is that Nightmare might have violated their pact when he caused the cult to revive her father and attempt to finish what she started. I'm not really sure what the logic there is, but it's the best I've got. Maybe she wanted to be the one to finish him off or something. Wow. Analyzing this series has been a roller coaster. I was anxiously awaiting the series finale this Halloween, and my previous video on the series blew up in a way I could never have expected, and I only have the man himself to thank for that. But seriously, I'd like to extend a personal, massive thank you to Pixel for working so tirelessly on the series for us all to enjoy, and somehow cramming more lore into FNAF. I always enjoy media where the villain doesn't die, because it leaves the door open for so much more to come out of them. And while Pixel has said he'll deviate away from the series from here on out, I'll still anticipate each new animation the same way I did for the Masked Resurgence or Devotion. As for me, the only reason my channel is even somewhat popular is because of this series, so not only will it eternally have a special place in my heart, but I may come back to it in the far future for a ranking video or something, or maybe sooner if you guys would like me to. However, I won't keep your attention for much longer, I swear. The Masked Resurgence and the Masked Devotion are stories of loss, vengeance, and quite a lot of demonic robot animals, and now, the storybook opened over half a decade ago has finally closed. Thank you, Pixel.